Welcome to the Research Works podcast. My name is Dr. Dana Poole and I get the privilege of bringing to you a very special series this week. I am here in Slovenia at the European Academy of Childhood Disability, interviewing the researchers and presenters about their work. This is very exciting and I can't wait for you to delve into this whole research conference series. We hope you enjoy the series. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Research Works podcast here in Slovenia, EACD 2023. It is the final day, third and final day of the conference, and there is no shortage of incredible people that I've been able to speak with. And I guess now is someone that I've actually met online before in a previous conference. So this is the first time we've met in person, which I feel like that's what I've been saying to a lot of people lately, the post-pandemic vibes. So welcome to the show, Assistant Professor Sudarshan Dayanidhi. Welcome. Did I say surname right or did I change it? I changed it, didn't I?
That's okay. I think that was close enough.
No,
that's good.
Everyone's been too kind. How do I say his surname? You say it.
Dayanidhi.
Dayanidhi. See, I put the wrong emphasis there. But thank you for being so agreeable with my terrible pronunciation. From the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab and NorthWestern University, how has the conference been for you so far?
It's been great. I mean, I was at the Barcelona conference last year, or the EACD conference in Barcelona last year.
Wonderful. Okay.
And so slowly, this conference, I think, is more like it feels normal, where we're back to discussing things rather than, am I wearing a mask? Did I remove my mask? Can I talk to people? Am I not?
Are we shaking hands? Are we fist bumping? Yeah, it's been really lovely to see people in person, and I think that's where great collaborations are born, right? Actually seeing people and talking about it. And the topic that you presented at this conference is something that we haven't spoken about on the podcast much at all, actually, and very interested in this because we often talk about the importance of muscle in children with cerebral palsy, but you go that next step further. And the title of your presentation was Mitochondrial Energetics in Impaired Muscle Growth and Across Functional Levels in Children with Cerebral Palsy. So many intriguing words in there. Talk to us first about what you mean by mitochondrial energetics, because I feel like that's something where we need to probably really establish first.
Yeah, so I mean, I think everybody sort of knows, at least in the US, the thing is, if you go to anybody and just mention the word mitochondria, they're like powerhouse of the cell. That's like a thing everybody knows. But what does that really mean? I mean, and what does that mean in muscle? So, we all know that we need to eat food, and the food helps with muscle utilization of energy. And so that energy actually is being produced within the mitochondria.
Right.
And so the mitochondria are probably producing 85 to 90% of the energy which a muscle can produce. And when a muscle needs that energy, it'll constantly keep producing that energy. And so that's sort of what we're interested in, is what happens in mitochondria in muscles in kids who develop, some muscles develop contractures, some muscles don't develop contractures. Some of these kids are in wheelchairs, some of them are more ambulatory. And so the question is, are there differences between all of these things? That's why I have so many cool things in my title, because I'm trying to capture a lot of things. But, roughly speaking, within our muscle, we have millions of mitochondria. And this is not just in kids with CP, but let's say you want to train for something. People train for marathons and run marathons with no training at all. And the way they sort of do it is because our muscles are very adaptive. And so they can build muscle by actually adding a lot of mitochondria, and then that way you have a lot of mitochondria which is producing energy that you need.
Wow.
But sort of the counter side of that is we are not moving much. Our muscles, mitochondria break down. They're not needed, so they just go away.
So that sort of disuse atrophy you often talk about with muscles, same thing happens with mitochondria.
Yeah, so I mean, when people talk about disuse atrophy, typically people talk about the fiber size becoming smaller and all that, but within the muscle is fairly complex. Within the muscle, there's all kinds of other things. But one of the things that we know for a fact is that mitochondria breaks down and that mitochondria goes away. So when somebody, and it's true, when, let's say, you have a cast in your arm from fracture or something, when you remove the cast, you sort of have to make that muscle grow. And that muscle will, it's not just making the muscle bigger, it's also building all the mitochondrial networks which are needed for that muscle to have energy.
Right.
So
I can see why that's so important, because you really again, like you said before, muscle is so adaptive. It's very plastic. So we've got great opportunities there, but it can go in either direction.
Exactly.
Right. And so how do you actually study mitochondria? Like how do you look at that? For someone who's like a physiotherapist like me, it's sort of outside the skin is kind of what I sort of look at, but you go a bit deeper.
Yes, I'm a physio. I trained as a pediatric physical therapist, as we say, but and so I think for me, the sort of entry into mitochondrial world sort of was a new thing. As part of my postdoctoral training that I did with Rick Lieber and Simon Schenk, who coincidentally is from Australia, even though he was in the US then, and even now. But Simon Schenk taught me a lot of mitochondrial methods.
Right.
And so there are many ways in which you can look at mitochondria.
Okay.
And so, typically you kind of can, and these are methods actually which are cool because these are methods Nobel Prize winners have used. So at times I'm like, oh. But the basic idea that we know is, if you go back and look at your mitochondria, you have something called the electron transport chain. That electron transport chain has one part, the fourth complex. That has 4 complexes plus ATP synthase. So the ATP synthase is the one which is generating energy.
Yeah.
And the 4 complexes of the electron transport chain are the ones which are sort of like passing the electrons. And the 4th complex is the one which utilizes oxygen.
Right. Okay.
So the basic premise is is using those complexes.
Yep.
So the basic premise is like back in the day, people are like, if you just took some muscle, put it into a chamber which measures the amount of oxygen you can consume.
Okay.
You're like, oh, that is consuming oxygen. What's going on? How do we use that oxygen?
I see.
And so that's sort of how the whole thing started. And
wow.
if you go back and read the history of how people discovered how mitochondria actually function, it's kind of bizarre. It just it took people decades and decades to figure out who's doing what.
That is incredible.
But the way we measure it is sort of like the classic way in which you take a piece of biopsy and you sort of like prep it under microscopes, and then you like do things so you can get substrates and things into it, which is basically food.
Right.
And then we see what the mitochondria are doing. And while we put everything into a chamber which measures oxygen, so we are essentially measuring oxygen consumption. And the more oxygen consumption you have, the more the mitochondria are utilizing that oxygen. Consequently, the more energy they're producing.
I see. Okay. So looking at all those relationships.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we don't actually directly measure energy of like ATP production. What we are measuring is oxygen consumption. And based on that, we are inferring that it would be producing more energy.
I love that. So within that context, then, what was the aim of your presentation that you presented the other day?
So a couple of years ago, we published a paper. There were 2 papers. One from like the stuff out of my postdoctoral training that I did, and the other one was from Ferdinand von Walden's group in Sweden. And so both of us showed that there are alterations in mitochondria, but the way we are doing the measurements is basically on frozen tissue, where, as I said, you have many complexes, and the way we're doing it is looking at tiny pieces of those complexes and figuring out how those complexes are functioning. So that doesn't tell us how the whole mitochondrial electron transport chain is functioning. And so the only way to actually do that is by doing it in fresh tissue as soon as you get a biopsy from a child. And so what I presented here essentially is work we have been doing for many years. And so in this study, we were mostly interested in what is the difference between contractured muscle and non-contractured muscle? Secondly, as I told you, like if you don't use your muscles or if something happens and your muscles undergo atrophy, the mitochondria will change. So we sort of also got some biopsies from kids who had typically developing kids who had ACL injuries. And so ACL injuries are a big, factor for you're like as a physio, your quads basically take a beating.
They do, don't they? Very quickly so.
Very, very quickly so. And so we are like, this would be like a great sort of positive control. And so we sort of got, biopsies from kids who are having surgery to repair their ACL. And then finally, the third part of it is the one I think is very interesting, is what happens to mitochondria within a contractured muscle if a kid is ambulatory versus a kid is primarily in a wheelchair. So if a kid is a GMFCS level 2 versus a kid is a GMFCS level 5. So, my like intuitively, like just as a physio, as a physiologist, I would be like, somebody walking, somebody spending most of their time in a wheelchair, their mitochondria should be different.
Yeah. And what was it? Tell us.
So that's the last part. So let me tell you first what we found. So firstly, like not surprisingly, the kids who have ACL injuries, their mitochondrial function is lower than non-contractured muscles.
Okay.
So we're looking at vastus lateralis muscles in kids with CP.
Okay.
And we're comparing it with either the vastus lateralis or vastus medialis muscles in kids with typically developing kids with ACL injuries.
Yeah, sure.
And so ACL injured muscle mitochondria definitely function lower.
Yes.
Which is good and bad. I mean, it's bad for the kids with TD, but it's good for the kids with CP because we're saying that the non-contracted muscle is actually functioning pretty well.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
But the second part of it was sort of more interesting, where we were thinking what happens, between a contractured muscle and non-contractured muscles. If you look, so we got biopsies from kids who are having surgery. So all of these kids were having surgeries.
Yep.
So we were looking at kids who are having muscle lengthening surgeries for the adductor or gastrocnemius.
Okay.
And we're comparing those muscles as contractured muscles, and we're comparing it with the vastus lateralis.
Okay.
And, as a group, contractured muscles are lower than, non-contractured muscles in terms of mitochondrial function.
Interesting.
But if you compare them with kids with typically developing kids with ACL injuries, the gastrocnemius is higher and the adductor is similar. So
right.
So it sort of is the main sort of takeaway from that, for me anyway, is that muscle contractures are not just atrophic processes. There's other stuff going on in there. And so I think that's why we were using these kids with typical development with ACL injuries, because if all of them look the same, then we sort of are like, okay, at least from a mitochondrial perspective, everything is just undergoing atrophy, and that's it. And I'll come to the more interesting thing in a second, but I think the other thing to remember here is that these are kids. They're growing. Their muscle is growing. And so, we don't expect to have just a pure atrophic process going on, because even kids who are in wheelchairs, they're still growing, and they still do things. It's not that they're in wheelchairs only. I mean, they still move and they do things, and their muscle is anyway growing. So that's sort of like the thing of it is that, and I think that's where some of these kids with CP are stuck, is their muscle is trying to grow, but their muscle also not being utilized as much. And so it's sort of undergoing some sort of disuse atrophy, but it's also undergoing mitochondrial biogenesis and all these things which happen during muscle growth. And that's sort of like what we are trying to figure out is, what exactly is going on within that muscle.
Such a complex process.
Yeah.
When you consider, like you said, it's not like these are not adults where they're not growing. You would expect to be quite static. There is just constant change that's happening, but at a rate that is a bit different too.
Yeah. I think a couple of years ago in 2019, there's a paper in Journal of Physiology from Brian Glancy's group, who's at Washington, D.C. or at Bethesda at NIH. And they kind of looked at this as a mouse tissue, but they kind of show that mitochondria actually grow as a muscle is growing. Not surprisingly. And so, but I think they're the first people who kind of actually have shown that in like a very convincing way. And so what we want to know is, how do mitochondria grow in kids? And what happens when kids have cerebral palsy, and how is there any alteration? And if a muscle is smaller, do they still have sufficient number of mitochondria? And so that's sort of what we are trying to figure out.
Would knowing that sort of influence, in terms of what I do in my practice, does that influence sort of some of the parameters that we might, recommend? We always try to recommend more activity, but, how much is too much and what's too little, and, what's the muscle actually capable of?
So I think that leads to the third finding that we had, which is, as I said, intuitively, you would think that kids who are, GMFCS level 2, their mitochondrial function would be greater than kids who are GMFCS level 5. And in our case, we didn't see that at all.
Wow.
So their mitochondria, at least in contractured muscles, because that's what you're looking at, it looks identical, like there is no difference. So the clinical sort of takeaway from it for me is that kids who are GMFCS level 2s are not doing enough. I mean,
Wow.
we know for a fact that they have a lot of sedentary behaviors.
Yeah.
And so I think that their sedentary behaviors are high enough that you need a certain amount of input
Yes.
for the muscle to be able to do things.
Yes. Yep.
And so I think that as a physio, I would say the thing is that we just need to get them to be moving more.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Ferdinand von Walden and I and Annika Cruz and Linnea, we had a mini symposium about frame running and activity.
Yes. Yes.
And so I think
Yes.
that sort of like the discussion which we had from the whole thing was basically saying that kids with CP need to move more, like if they're capable of moving. And Hendrik, who's a frame runner, he shared a video with us in that symposium. He's in Sweden. And he said that for him, because he spends a lot of time in a wheelchair, but when he does frame running, for him, that's when he can actually feel free and active and he can move and feel like an athlete.
Yeah. And I think that's it, isn't it? We are constantly trying to find, we know we need to get people to move more.
Yep.
And we probably need a lot of innovation sometimes thinking about how we can get people to move more. Because that's why at this conference you've been hearing about, can we identify the barriers? What are the facilitators? Because we need to find ways for people to move more. And you've added this incredible piece to that as well by understanding the why behind it. I think there's so many factors for it, but it's just so vital to think about the person and their overall health. For you, what's the so what for clinicians when they're listening to why people need to move more? We know that there's the health benefits, but what does this contribute to it?
So if you look in the mitochondrial literature, there is the huge emphasis not in kids with CP, but there's a whole thing with aging. Like if you just search for mitochondria in PubMed, you'll find probably most articles you'll find is related to aging.
Yeah.
And with aging, we know our mitochondrial function declines.
Yeah.
And some of like my data, because I have some other things I'm doing with Mary McDermott, who's a collaborator of mine at Northwestern University. She's interested in people with peripheral artery disease, but we also look at people who are aging without peripheral artery disease. And some of our data and other people have shown that the distance you can walk is associated with your mitochondrial function.
Wow.
And so sort of the so what I think is that we need to think a little long term.
Yes.
So it's not just in terms of kids, it's as they become adults.
Yes.
Because we do know, everybody knows that, the transition from adolescence to adulthood and later on is really tricky. I mean, and especially kids or GMSCS level 3s and 4s, for them, I think, or even 2s for that matter.
Sure.
There are changes which happen. And I know people who have CP who say that, they're adults now, but they say, I feel like I should walk better when I was, younger.
Yeah.
And I get more tired now.
Yeah.
And some of those things are obviously related to muscle changes.
Yeah. And I guess that investment early on, but it's also a lifelong to be able to maintain that level of functioning. We need to always be thinking about that. So they're not going from a place of too much deficit. We get them to a place where they've actually got some reserve and to be able to continue to function.
Yeah, and I don't know if you got a chance to talk to Mark Peterson, who's also here at the EACD.
And I still need to hunt him down. I've been messaging him. I need to see him still.
Yeah, he's here. Yeah. He gave a mini symposium the other day about like aging and CP, and he always has this figure in his presentations where he sort of shows you, you go up in your functionality, and then as you start becoming older, you decline.
Yeah.
And once you sort of start declining to a certain point, it's very hard to come back up.
Yeah.
And so I think from that perspective, trying to do more and trying to get into more of and this is not, rehab. This is sort of more like just a healthy lifestyle kind of a thing.
That's right. Yeah.
And so trying to get people to move more and do more things, I think is what I would say.
It's a modifiable health promotion strategy, isn't it? And it's something that we can do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other sort of side of it, which we didn't touch upon, is metabolic. There's a lot of things that happen metabolically.
Yeah.
And so, our metabolism slows down. Like there's a higher risk for people to develop all kinds of things.
True.
And so some of the stuff that Mark Peterson and Jennifer Ryan and others have shown is that in adults with CP, you have a higher risk for all kinds of other things.
Yeah.
And so I think that's all of this sort of stems potentially from not saying from mitochondria, but from like activity and lack of activity.
It's a big contributor.
Yeah.
It's a really big contributor. Well, I feel like today you just stimulated so much thought and you've actually brought so many areas together. Thank you so much for doing that. I feel like that was a crash course literature review in the area, which was absolutely phenomenal. And it's always and something that I think people are always wanting to understand more of. And you explained that so beautifully. So thank you for really stimulating that thought for so many of us. And thank you for all the work that you're doing in this space.
No, thank you. I mean, I think so the reason I'm able to bring some of these things, hopefully in a convincing way, is that because I had to teach myself all this. As I said, I'm a physio. Yeah. So I'm like, what are mitochondria? How do these things work?
Incredible. The possibilities of what we can do. It's incredible. So I think that's a wonderful example too, because, I didn't think that that would be an area that physios would go down. So it's wonderful. I love it.
Me neither. But I think at the end of the day, I think it all comes from like the time I spent, I spent 4 years at Shriners Hospital in Philadelphia working with kids. And so a lot of stuff that I do now is I used to work in a gate lab. I would see kids walking every day. And I'm like, all of that stuff is like, questions. What's going on in the muscle?
Ah, wonderful.
And that's where it
starts.
Yeah.
I was talking about that with Professor Nora Shields before. It just starts with that one question, sometimes a dangerous question, but it can lead down to an incredible path. So that's the beauty of research and science, isn't it? Yeah.
I'll leave you with one more thought, which is, the real question we want to know in these kids is what happens to their mitochondria in response to training.
Yeah.
As I said, our muscles are very trainable.
Yeah.
But they're also non-trainable at a certain point. So aging is a good example.
What does that look like?
So that's what we want to understand is what changes and are they modifiable?
Yeah.
And if they're not modifiable, how do we modify them?
Yeah.
So,
well, let's keep in touch. I think we need to keep talking about this. All the new discoveries will be wonderful. Well, it's lovely to finally meet you in person, and thank you for your time. And to all of our listeners, I really hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Stay tuned for so much more. Talk to you again soon. Bye.